conditions in countries where they are temperate as opposed to tropical. Here in Barbados, we don't have those challenges in terms of having to heat our homes. We cool our homes, we have to turn on the fans, Mr. President, but at the same time, we are also navigating the impact in a very different way of increasing energy prices, and therefore this measure to limit the impact of the value-added tax as an additional charge on top of the cost of fuel is an important measure. Mr. President, we will have a lot of discussion later on this week, and I don't want to preempt what that discussion is going to be about electricity rates and what that means. But today, this administration is making a commitment, as we have done in the Prices Compact. We heard, Mr. President, on Monday from the Prime Minister that despite the application of the compact on prices to keep the markups at a cap of 15%, and I want to spend just a moment talking about that, Mr. President, because from my ministry, we publish on a monthly basis the monitoring of prices. Our Consumer Affairs Department, they send out teams into the fields, Mr. President. They look at the various partners who are signatory to the compact. We compare what those prices are within the compact, and we also look at what the prices are outside of the compact. What we're dealing with, Mr. President, and I hear a lot of commentary sometimes, which is in fact unfortunate, because this is a compact that caps markups. It is not a price control measure. And given the fact that it is not and it cannot be a price control measure where you're attempting to artificially intervene in the marketplace, there are a couple of things that we have to be very clear on. And those of us in the room who understand the way in which the markets work would understand what I'm talking about, because in the first instance, when we talk about first costs, the first costs being assumed by the importer, Mr. President, have gone up. And so if we are being asked to purchase a product, that product has multiple layers of prices layered into it. The first cost, what they're paying for it from the person who they're buying it for, wherever they're buying it. Then you have the cost of domestic transportation to be able to transport, have the transport logistics, ship it to the port from which it is being shipped from. And yes, we have seen a reduction in the percentages being charged for shipping, freight. Freight rates are coming down. Shipping rates went up over the last few years by 300, 500% in some instances. But, Mr. President, we are seeing from the Far East, the prices are normalizing for shipping again. We're seeing from the Eastern Europe, from Europe, we're seeing Western Europe in particular, we are seeing prices normalizing. And so shipping rates have come back almost to pre-2019 levels. But we're seeing that instead of that same trend holding true in the North American region, that has not been the case. The shipping rates for products and goods, cargo being transported from the North American region still remain at COVID-19 peak levels. Now, what does that mean and how does that translate into pricing for Barbadians? We principally, Mr. President, ship a lot of our cargo from or through the United States. It is offloaded in some instances into the United States and then transshipped down into the Caribbean region, starting in some instances in Jamaica, and then depending on the product, it is transshipped down into the Eastern and the Southern Caribbean on smaller vessels because of the size of our ports. And so, Mr. President, what that means is that if we were to rationalize that the bulk of our imports are coming through U.S. ports, and the costs there are still high for shipping, for transportation, they are perhaps at the highest levels that they have been in the United States' history, simply because the ground transportation sector is still facing massive labor charges. What that means is that there is going to be an impact on that final item when it lands here in Barbados. But what have we done as well? Where we have control of the supply chain, we have attempted to intervene in the market. So we have control, Mr. President, over the application of the value-added tax onto electricity rates to be able to minimize the impact on Barbadian householders, and we've intervened in that space. We have the ability to collaborate with our partners without being heavy-handed to put a cap on the markups that they can apply on top of their pricing to certain items which constitute the basic basket of items that Barbadians are consuming. But we also have the ability to apply a cap also at 2019 levels on shipping rates and the rates that we apply. And so we have seen that the CIF rate has been capped by this administration at 2019 levels. So where we can intervene as an administration in the marketplace, this government has done just that. What we cannot control are the international energy prices. What we cannot control, regretfully, are the first costs. What we cannot control are shipping. If we were to talk about how many products we purchase from places like China, Mr. President, we purchase a significant number of our products, our manufactured goods in particular, from China. But we also know that during COVID-19, during the pandemic, manufacturing in China reduced by 40%. So the production rates out of China as a result of the extended periods of lockdown and closures of their factories reduced Chinese manufacturing output by 40%. That's almost half, Mr. President. What that has also meant is that that resulted in disruptions in supplies. And scarcity in economic terms will result in increased prices. It also meant, Mr. President, that people then had to find, and importers had to find, alternate markets. What were some of those alternate markets? You found a lot of production then shifting to places like Turkey. But, Mr. President, look at what happened over the course of the last week. We've had a major natural disaster in Turkey, and so the expectation in some instances is that that may have some impact on the supply chain there as well. I think the point, Mr. President, that I am making here by pointing out the correlations between what's happening globally, what's happening in certain countries, what's happening with prices, and how those things are impacting us here in Barbados is simply that where we as a government have control over the measures that are impacting Barbadians, we have given a commitment, and we continue to take that commitment seriously to ease Barbadians. Where there are things which are outside of our control, then we are asking Barbadians to hold strain and to make choices that are in the best interest of each individual household. For example, there may be things that I may like to buy, but I may have to make choices. I may not be able to buy 10 of one thing, I may have to buy 2. I may not be able to make something that may have lasted me a month, I may have to make it last slightly longer and be in moderation, because there are a number of things that we expect, Mr. President, coming down the pipeline. Just late last year, Mr. President, we had a hurricane pass through the Northern Caribbean. That hurricane created disruption in the petroleum product supply here on island. Why was that, Mr. President? It meant that the shipping that came out of places like St. Eustatius and in the Northern Caribbean more generally, but specifically St. Eustatius and the Dominican Republic, that would have been able to get products like our heavy fuel oil and so on into the country, had to be disrupted. What that meant was that we came in some instances perilously close to not having fuel products on island. But we were able to navigate that. But what that ended up causing, Mr. President, was an increase in the cost of shipping. A shipment that ordinarily would have cost the National Petroleum Corporation through the Barbados National Oil Company $1 million cost them $5 million, Mr. President. That is a significant increase in pricing. But we cannot pass those prices on to Barbadian consumers, and so the companies are absorbing those shocks. A hurricane in the north of the Caribbean causes a 500% increase in a single shipment to a single product. But we have to be able to service Barbadians. We also have challenges, Mr. President, in some instances where the inputs for certain products become challenging. Mr. President, we are all watching the road works taking place in the country. And who would imagine that the road works is connected in any way to our energy products? But we have companies on island, Mr. President, that produce asphalt. One of the primary inputs of asphalt is heavy fuel oil. It has to be imported. If there are challenges, and there have been challenges, with the importation of that heavy fuel oil into country, and when there are delays in the importation of that heavy fuel oil into the country, it impacts things as simple and so seemingly as unconnected as our roadworks program, Mr. President. Those are the realities of global supply, and in this instance, in some instances, regional supply chain challenges over which we at times have no control. One of the challenges that we have at times trying to find dirty ships, that's what you call them, dirty ships, to be able to bring heavy fuel oil into the country in order to make sure that we have enough to produce on a daily basis. I think it's 100,000 tons that the company produces of asphalt a day. But they need the heavy fuel oil as the major input, and that principally comes into Barbados from the Dominican Republic. So over the Christmas period, where we were having challenges with getting the roadworks done, and we were pushing forward to a target, and through the Ministry of Transport and Works, they had an aggressive timeline, many people would not have connected energy challenges or fuel product challenges with the roadworks, but it was a part of the consideration. And you would have seen here, many of you would have seen in November last year, myself, the Minister with responsibility for transport, Senior Minister with responsibility for infrastructure, meeting right here with the officials in Parliament while Senate was in session, because these things are all connected. And we're trying to make sure that we can find solutions that serve the interests of the Barbadian public. And so, Mr. President, with these few words, I want to commend this resolution to have the value-added tax extended temporarily extended, the reduction of it, that is, at 7.5% on the electricity bills for Barbadian householders over the period of February 1 through to September 2023. I beg to move, therefore, Mr. President, that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cudley. Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to just briefly make a contribution on the bill that is before us, Mr. President, because it is part of a very robust and timely conversation that we're having nationally about the cost of living. And the measure principally that is incorporated into the bill in implementing the reduction of the value-added tax on energy at 250 kilowatts, primarily for households, is an olive branch by the government recognizing that persons are feeling the brunt of escalating prices. And because we heard yesterday that there would be some type of determination by the Fair Trading Commission sometime today, it may even be a saving grace, Mr. President, once this is passed this morning, but nonetheless. But in any event, sir, as the leader of government business noted, the cost of living crisis is clearly not unique to Barbados. This is a global problem that we are all facing. And what is clear, Mr. President, is across the board, governments have been using various tools, whether it's fiscal tools, and here in Barbados we don't use monetary tools necessarily to address these types of problems, but we saw last year the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England increase interest rates, trying to dampen these rising costs that are coming across the pipeline in terms of consumer prices and to curb inflation. But, Mr. President, as a small island state, there are a number of factors also that we must consider as well that are unique to us. As was said by the leader of government business, we import a lot of this inflation. It is not due to any domestic circumstance. It's not due to anything that's happening locally that we're experiencing these problems. This may be controversial to say, but we also have relatively high labor costs in Barbados relative to productivity, Mr. President. So that is also a context that we have to incorporate into discussion when we're talking about prices. And then we have restrictive productive capacity. There are not many avenues by which we make a lot of foreign exchange or a lot of money We know that the tourism sector is the primary sector that drives a lot of economic activity in Barbados. And then incorporated into all of that, Mr. President, is the government going into its second IMF program, trying to maintain fiscal discipline. So what are our options to address the cost of living crisis? Mr. President, I just want to first say, and I think any right-thinking person can say, there is no magic bullet. There are some experts who are saying we have peaked in terms of prosperity globally, in terms of where the Industrial Revolution has brought us, in terms of prosperity, increasing standard of living, and now we're actually going through a time of decline, a general decline. That is one of the theses that are out there in terms of assessing what is happening globally. But, Mr. President, there is no magic bullet. But I believe that on the fiscal side, and in terms of regulatory tools, there are some things that we could explore, Mr. President. And let me first talk about the fiscal side. Mr. President, we have a situation where in Barbados, there is a perception that we have both high indirect taxes and we have high direct taxation. So is there space and scope for us to evaluate the entire tax structure? Where is the greatest burden being placed? Which taxes are those placing the highest burden? Who is it affecting, Mr. President? And can a new structure or a redesigning of the tax structure give relief while obviously still maintaining fiscal discipline, Mr. President? Let us start with personal income tax. Personal income tax at the lower end, Mr. President, is at 12.5%, and the higher rate is 28.5%. Taking into account when one looks at their paycheck, there are some other things that comes out of the paycheck. There's a pandemic levy, that is a temporary measure. There's a health levy. And then obviously, it is not a tax, but it is a mandatory contribution that you have to make, the rate of NAS, which when the employee pays 11%, if you're self-employed, it's 17.1%. On aggregate, Mr. President, that is a hefty amount of taxation coming out of your direct income. But Barbados is not necessarily an anomaly in this regard. Jamaica has an income tax rate of between 25 and 30%. St. Lucia, 10% to 30%. Grenada, 10 to 28%. But on the other side of things, Mr. President, you have places like Antigua, Bahamas, and St. Kitts that have zero income tax. Those three countries here in the Caribbean do not pay income tax. So there is scope, Mr. President, for us to redesign the tax structure, or at least explore where the burden is being carried. Mr. President, and if we say we go the route of reducing the amount of direct taxation, then we have to look at what is being applied in terms of indirect taxes and other tax rates. So we know that VAT is at 17.5%, and on mobile services is at 22%. So clearly then, Mr. President, there are areas by which there is changes that can be made for us to somewhat regularize the tax system to bring relief, but still maintaining fiscal discipline. So on top of that, we have things like customs duties, the petroleum tax, the fuel tax, land tax, travel tax, foreign currency tax, across the board. And when all of these are accumulated, it seems as though there's a real sense that on both earnings and on consumption, Barbados is heavily taxed. And given the unique experience that we're having in terms of the cost of living crisis, Mr. President, is there a way by which we redesign the tax structure? By it that we reduce the amount of direct taxation on one end and increase the level of indirect taxes on the other end, or vice versa, Mr. President? Sir, if we say reduce the amount of income tax, and some people would like it to go to zero. A lot of us would like it to go to zero. 15% VAT is not necessary. It is, by and large, what is usually applied, but there are some countries that have higher rates of value-added tax. Mr. President, Hungary has a 27% value-added tax. Croatia, Denmark, Sweden all have 25% value-added tax. Cyprus, Germany, Romania, 19%. So you realize that although there's a status quo in terms of the taxes that we pay, and it's a business as usual, there are variations across the world by which we can start to explore, are there ways by which we change how we apply taxation, where is it being applied, and give consumers, households relief in the event that it is allowing us to still be fiscally disciplined. Mr. President, if we say we reduce the amount of disposed income on direct taxes or income, I think in that scenario, that alleviates the pressure of government having to increase salaries and wages. Because it will have the same type of effect. There's more disposable income in people's pockets if you reduce the direct income tax that is coming out of their paycheck. So rather than having a conversation about increasing wages and salaries, which has a secondary knock-on effect on the inflationary existing pressures, which we know we don't control, then is that an option that we can take? But that also still has to be taken into account. Do we give persons more disposable income, and does it have an effect on our foreign reserves? Because we know that 80 cents of every dollar that is spent goes into imports. So there is a balancing act that has to occur, but I'm just proposing, and I'm just asking the question, if there's some kind of analysis, some kind of assessment that can be done in relation to the national tax structure and how can it be redesigned with the two priorities at this moment, which is alleviating the pressures in terms of how persons are being impacted by higher prices and obviously still maintaining macroeconomic stability, Mr. President. So essentially, what I am proposing, whether it is through the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, the central bank, I don't know if somebody has already done this type of work. But what is clear is we have to have a tax structure that is possibly more nimble, that can have variations as external shocks and changes happen in the local environment, that allow persons to realize or understand that the government is not just increasing taxes because that's what governments do, but they recognize that there's a sound and sober analysis that is happening in terms of the entire tax structure, that we all recognize this is a fair exchange that is happening in our society. Because, Mr. President, one of the things that is very clear is higher taxes, people just try to evade them, avoid them. You don't want to encourage that type of behavior if the tax structure is too cumbersome and too restricted. And then you have also the social aspect of it, where people who are younger in their productive years say, I don't see the benefit of working this hard for this level of income. And they migrate out of Barbados in search of a better living. And those are some of the real realities we have to look at when we're talking about the tax structure. So although we're looking at value-added tax on electricity today, I think it opens the door for us to ask the question, do we have the right type of tax structure in Barbados to suit the burden and where we want to place that burden, through which types of taxation, Mr. President, and is it fair, equitable, and just? Because, Mr. President, I will be the first to stand here and say I am wholeheartedly against pensions being tax accessible. If a person has worked in their productive years, they've paid their fair share, they have been diligent, and they've put aside funds for their elder years, they're not allowed to work. They can't work in most instances. Why is it then that they then have to turn around and still continue to pay taxation on their pension? And I think those are the types of conversations that we have to have, Mr. President. Because what has to happen, Mr. President, is there has to be alleviation somewhere. Because in any society where people feel as though there is an unfair treatment and they do not feel as though they are part and parcel of the benefits, Mr. President, there will be social discontent and tension, and you cannot run a society with those types of characteristics. We know that it is problematic, Mr. President. So, just very quickly, Mr. President, I want to state that, going back to a point that the leader of government business noted, in relation to the publication of the consumer prices, I am not aware of that publication, and I don't know if there can be an expanded campaign promotion of that consumer price list, as well as, Mr. President, I know that it is calculated, the consumer price index. I'm not sure if it's through also the ministry that consumer price index is calculated, but if we can have that either on a monthly basis or quarterly basis in the newspaper through GIS, Mr. President, it is. But, Mr. President, what is clear is we need more information. However, if it is now moved from traditional media to social media, some kind of expansion of that campaign, because people also feel as though the social compact has happened and prices have not gone down. So I think the onus now is on the government, is on the partners in the social compact to come and give actually a rigorous assessment to say to consumers, we've gone through this for 6 months. These are the measures that we've put in place. And we estimate that consumers saved $10 million, $20 million. These are just arbitrary numbers that I'm throwing out. But persons have a feeling and a perception that you've given something in one, and you've taken it in another. Because the prices on goods that are deemed necessary have somewhat leveled out or been reduced, but the prices on other things have doubled. Gone up by $5, $7, Mr. President. So it is the onus of those in the compact, and this is not me saying that the compact is not a good thing, because even in France, the Minister of Finance in France has asked for retailers to start selling certain goods at cost to consumers. So the government has a very good initiative in principle, but I think what has to be done now is to come to the public and give the public very clear indications of what those savings are, because there is a bit of a confusion at the moment that it is, smoke and mirrors and it looks good, but people aren't really feeling the effects of the social compact in terms of reduced prices. So, Mr. President, I want to support the bill, and I am hoping that it is not a saving grace, given the pronouncements to come later today, for those who are paying attention to what is happening. But it is an indication that the government is clearly trying to make specific interventions into addressing the cost of living. But as I said, I think it is an opportunity for us to look at the tax structure, redesign it in a way that the burden is really shared across the board. And there's some things that we say as a society, this is the bare minimum by which we will operate in Barbados in terms of social goods and services. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Other speakers? Senator Cummings, or Senator Dr. Raffet.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to all senators. Mr. President, I think you will agree with me that the period 2019, 2020, 2021 have been challenging times across the world. We have seen increasing levels of poverty in both developed and developing countries, increasing levels of unemployment, deprivation, and critical challenges for countries, especially those in the developing world, small island developing states, struggling to balance their budgets and to come to terms with the increasing cost of health care and other situations that were presented by the COVID pandemic. In Barbados, of course, we have suffered considerable contraction of our economy as a result of COVID, given the fact that we're so dependent on the tourism sector, and we're all aware of what happened to tourism during the COVID pandemic period. Here in Barbados, we have also seen increasing levels of unemployment and increasing dependence on government financing for those who are less privileged and who were challenged by the pandemic that caused such disruption and dislocation in our economy and in our society. The relief that is being proposed, the extension of this reduction, this relief that is being proposed, in my opinion, will help to reduce the stress of the poor. It will help those who are less endowed to continue to support their families and to pay their energy bill. There's no doubt about it, Mr. President, that the cost of energy at the level of the country and at the level of the household is a great necessity in today's world. And while I agree that we should carry out analyses of the impact of this relief on the national budget and on the situation of the poor, I think that while we do that, we must also continue the relief. You know, there's an old saying that while the grass is growing, the horse may be starving. You cannot allow the horse to starve while you're trying to get the grass to grow. And therefore, let us not wait to do all the analyses that need to be done. Let us do the analysis, yes, but let us provide the relief in the meantime. And let us do all that we can to support efforts that bring about better social equity in our country. It is a responsibility, I think, of all of us, and I commend the government for the action they're taking to bring about relief through the extension of the facilities with respect to the VAT on the electricity bills. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Bradford. Your Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I hadn't really planned to speak on this, truth to tell. But as both Senator Cummings and then Senator Dr. Drakes, and then Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Future events can sell a shot.
I prophesy. It will be, and the church says, amen. So it really made me reflective, and I want to speak in those terms for just a few minutes, sir, not just a few minutes, sir. I want to support this measure, and I really want to, and the clocks will stop here. I want to support this measure, and I want to really congratulate the government because over the course of the last couple years, there has been severe pressure felt by nationals, in fact, by people all over the world. There are no two ways about that. And government has, in a situation really where its resources, its revenues were severely constrained by people being unable to pay taxes, by people being unable to meet bills and costs and dues to government, and by the fact that our major revenue earnings were considerably reduced by the impact of COVID on take-ins in respect of tourism. The country was virtually shut down. Barbadians wanted that. And then at the same time, we were having challenges in respect of the financial services sector because of blacklisting, grey listing, threats of adverse listings. People forget that was part of what the government was fighting at the time. So essentially, government was in a fight to maintain a level of revenue to carry its operations. We were in a fight to ensure that the country stayed afloat in the context of a terrible external pressure, and we were in a fight to address the legitimate and sometimes not legitimate needs and demands of a national population. And I will go on to elaborate on why I say that some of the demands were not necessarily legitimate. And the reality is that this is a society where people make very high demands of the government. So I want to first, in making my observations, congratulate the government for what I think has generally been a very good job in trying to juggle these multiple demands and doing so relatively well. Barbados, whether you are a supporter of the government or not, you would have to say that we have come out of what has been a period of extreme global contraction and stricture relatively unscathed, and are again appearing to do well, to bounce back, and to have a high level of social and economic resilience. But the fact that electricity costs are so high, fuel costs, because often the public does not consider that fuel is a driver of every single economic activity. So that if you want cement delivered to your construction site and fuel costs go up, your end product becomes more expensive because the input from the fuel is higher. You want a hamburger, a roti, or some rice and stew. The cost of producing it is higher. The transport from the vendor, the wholesaler, to the retailer, to the person who is cooking for you, and then the cost of actually producing the food is higher, and so on. And so there is a cascading impact across the economy every time fuel prices go up. And people don't see that. They complain about what they pay at the pump without also understanding that a consequential pressure is building up across the economy, across every sector of activity. And this is why government's transition and policy to transition to renewable energy at the national level is of such importance. It means that we are going to be using our own natural resources to reduce our part of the $9 billion per annum that the Caribbean imports in fuel costs. It means that insofar as that then is an input, fuel becomes an input to every single economic activity, that we have better control of what is happening in our economy. We are able to reduce costs and spending. Government will have at its disposal more capital, which it can then invest in other developmental activities, and at the individual level, people will have greater disposable income. And this is why the HOPE project not only is transformational of the circumstances of the individuals who will get those homes, but as a flagship policy of government, it is an indicator of how people's circumstances can be transformed and how we can use renewable energy as a catalyst for development and as a catalyst for upward social mobility, by allowing people not only homes, but increased income through the revenues that will be generated and the savings that will be generated. But while we complain, and I want to speak about some of the contradictions that I see within Barbados, and this is why I talked about some of the complaints being legitimate and others not being so legitimate. We complain about high electricity costs, and everything that happens, we say, why the government don't do something? That's always the cry. Everything that happens, it doesn't matter that it is an international circumstance and it is affecting every country on the globe, they just don't want to deal with it. Why the government don't do something? So there is a war, you have disruptions in your supply chain, you go into the supermarket and your favorite product is not there. Why government don't do something? And so on, that's how we behave, and that is the reality. The call is constantly for the government to do something. Now, in relation to electricity, we talk about high electricity prices, but often you pass by buildings belonging to government, belonging to the private sector at night, and all the lights are on. I mean, that is commonplace. You go into hotels or restaurants or bathrooms in commercial buildings. We are not using sensors for the water. We are not using motion sensors for electricity. We are not doing anything to control our costs, whether it is in our homes or whether it is in commercial settings. But people are complaining about electricity prices because it is not for them to do what they can, but for government to do something. So I really want to caution that we all have to seriously start asking, what is our own individual role as private citizens and as private sector to do what we can to alleviate some of the costs and pressures without expecting that government will reduce the VAT. Because the reality is, and I'm glad that we're doing it, but the reality is that government itself cannot exist on reduced revenues indefinitely. You cannot expect government to cut VAT prices here to forego revenues there, to reduce taxes over yonder, and expect that simultaneously we can carry the same level of goods and services, and we can all make the same demands on the government coffers that we were making when revenues were as large as they used to be. That is the reality. So inherent in this is a contradiction that we need to confront. And I want to speak to a few others. Barbados and the Caribbean are price takers. I mean, that is a reality. We don't set the costs for goods and services on the international market. They are set by producers who are, to use a Bajan expression, over and away. Far, the centers of production and distribution are far from the location of the majority of small island developing states, whether they are in the Caribbean, or whether they are in the Pacific, or whether they are in Africa. That is the reality. And therefore, the cost of getting goods and services to us, and let us be realistic, it is commonplace that in the international marketplace, because of our small size, our prices tend to be higher. Because when you are selling volume, you sell at a lower price. When you are selling small quantities, you tend to push your markups up. So we paid more in small island developing states and in developing countries for COVID vaccines than did the developed world. We pay more for many items than do developed countries, partly because our volumes are so small that we are not necessarily important to the manufacturer or the producer or the supplier of the good. Because let us be realistic. If you had to send a few 100,000 of a particular item down to the Caribbean, where your cost of sending it, because the Caribbean is far, is going, especially if you're coming all down to Barbados, down south and east to Barbados, your cost is going to be high. You are going to send it instead to Latin America. Shorter distance, larger volume, you're making more money. And that is how the world works. So that when we start to complain about what government should and should not do, and why things about here are expensive, and so on and so forth, we have to understand what are the market drivers and the realities in which the government and the country and the region are operating. We are price takers, and there is a consequence of that. We have no power in the marketplace. We saw it during COVID, where there was vaccine hoarding, where countries virtually held on to product, and we couldn't get any, no matter what we were prepared to pay for it to protect our citizens at the time. I mean, and again, in this regard, Barbados was lucky. As you know, we were the first country in the Caribbean to be able to get COVID vaccines and to start to protect our population. So the whole issue then of pricing also impacts and has implications for food and nutrition security. We learned last week, if we didn't already know, that Barbados's food import bill is just about just under $800 million per annum. That is a significant amount of money. And unless we are prepared to start to produce more of our own food, more of our own goods, and address the issue of food and nutrition security, and simultaneously address the question of cost. Grow our food so we can reduce some of the import costs. Grow our food so we can reduce what we pay for it in the supermarket. Unless we are prepared to address that, then we have a challenge. Now, I heard my friend, Senator Dr. Drake, speak to the tax level in Barbados. I mean, Yeah, it sounds good. It sounds so natural. Dr. Drapes. Dr. Drapes, do not ask what the government going to do. So, no, Prime Minister Owen Arthur, God rest his soul, I think the old people would add that, used to say all the time that everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody wants to die. It's an expression that I absolutely love, because while Barbadians want high quality goods and services, are accustomed to high quality goods and services, we do not want to pay high taxes. But these things do not fall like manna from heaven. So when you talk about, I want to not pay direct taxes too. But what would be the equitable arrangement, indirect or indirect taxes? What mix can we do with direct taxation? These are questions we have to ask. But in the interim, when we point to those countries in the Caribbean that are not paying taxes, let us look and see where some of those countries are on the Human Development Index. Let us look and see what their road network and infrastructure is. Let us look and see what their telecommunications and internet services and distribution across the country are. Let us ask ourselves how many of their citizens have free education from nursery to tertiary. And people can get 2 and 3 degrees, masters and PhDs at the taxpayers' expense. And we want it. Because when government of the last administration sought to change that, the country went crazy. And it is part of the reason why government was changed. Let us understand that reality. In fact, I will share with you, I like an anecdote, but it helps to make things real. A person whom I know who was a candidate for the last, for the Democratic Labour Party, said to me that I know, I pray for them all the time. That he was passing on his way to speak at a meeting and saw the president of a DLP branch in the front of a BLP meeting, cheering and doing a number. He called him on his cell phone as soon as he could get phone, said, use a false name. Lord have mercy, George, what happened? He said, look, I got 3 daughters and they said to give him back free education, you understand? So let us understand that Bajans, they don't want the taxes, but they want the free education. Apart from, I talked about the road network, but it isn't only the road network. If government were to decide tomorrow that we're sending back the electric buses, who do you think would happen? They don't want the taxes, but they want the buses with the aircon and the Wi-Fi. And they would like them to give a little more noise so they could know when they're coming, but they want the buses. And though I'm adding a measure of levity, I think, Mr. President, sir, that you understand the point that I'm making here, that it is all right to talk about not having taxes. One of these countries that has no taxes in the region just got its first cinema. When Barbados has cinema and drive-in of choice. You can decide whether you're going on the West Coast and lie back in your seat and put up your foot and have somebody bring you a tray with a meal, or you can go up, to Christchurch, to the South Coast, and so you can decide if you're going in an SUV and go into the cinema on the South Coast with your posse and order and go into the cinema. Or you can go in your SUV and park in the back and let the windows fog up in the drive-in, You have choices in Barbados, you have choices. We have choices. No, Mr. President, these are the realities of our culture. These are the realities of our culture. When you go to the cinema, for those of you who go to drive, I'm told, sir, I'm told. I do not know personally. Right. So, no, she may yet learn. Sir, as I said, I'm using some measure of levity, but the reality is, and that is a real story, that there is a Caribbean island which pays no taxes, which only just got its first cinema. So let us make decisions about what we want as a populace. We're about to go into estimates. There are a number of very important conversations that need to take place between the government and the governed, between the citizenry and the politicians. What is it that Barbados can afford? The reality is that the country has a developed country lifestyle. And we will have to have a level of taxation that is commensurate with supporting that lifestyle. And if we do not want to pay the taxes, if we want reductions on everything, if we want to add more goods and services supplied by government, we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to pay the cost? And what is the cost? Because I don't think we know that when you have 3 children, it costs the government $75,000, not the government, the taxpayers, $75,000 a year to support your 3 children. And that has nothing to do with children from other households, with all of the enrollment at Cave Hill, or any other campus where where you study as a Barbadian and where your costs are met. And if you are doing a subject like medicine, then the cost gets closer, I believe, to $40,000 or $50,000 per annum. And how many doctors are we training every year? Do we want this lifestyle or don't we? And if we want this lifestyle, are we prepared to pay for it or not? And if we are prepared to pay for it, how much are we prepared to pay? And what specifically are we prepared to pay for? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. Now, a valid point was made in respect of the fact that the public complains that while government makes these interventions in the marketplace, we do not necessarily see the cost reductions. That is a legitimate concern. And the question is, what moral suasion or other measures can the government of Barbados use to ensure that when they give relief to private sector entities, that savings are then passed on to the consumer, to the taxpayer, to the public of Barbados, and that the vendors, the private sector, are not just using that relief to have a larger profit margin, or that they're not taking the relief and then adding prices to other goods and services that they may be selling. And while we talk about what we want the country to give us, we also have to ask, what are we prepared to give to the country? Do we see ourselves as partners in development? Do we believe that we have a responsibility when we are serving the public to serve them with dignity and respect and courtesy and to give them the best? Do we believe that it is our responsibility to work for a whole day, especially when we work for the government, and to work as hard as we possibly can and to solve problems for the country, for the public, for the political directorate, because the civil service is the arm, the delivery arm of the policymakers. And if there is a disconnect between one arm and the other, then the country is impacted. Then we aren't moving at the pace that we want. So we complain about how things are. But are we playing our part as citizens in ensuring that the country is the best that it can be, because we are performing exceptionally and with excellence every single day? We have to contribute, and the country needs to have a conversation about responsibilities as opposed to rights. It's my right to get free education, right? It's my right to do this, it's my right to do that, and you can't stop me from that because it's my right. But rarely do we hear conversations in Barbados about, I have the responsibility. I am staying late because I have a responsibility. I am going to give of my best because I have a responsibility to the public, to people who look like me, to other Barbadians, to the country that has given me so much, to the country that has given me my free education and my nice electric bus and my good road, etc., wonderful internet. I mean, we have so much to be grateful for. I have had the opportunity to travel throughout the Caribbean. I have not been to Saba. I've not been to Aruba, Bonaire, or Curacao, but I think I have been to every other Caribbean country. And I'm therefore in a position to compare what Barbados has, what Barbados offers its citizens, the quality of life that we enjoy, from roads, services, to the quality of goods you see in the stores, to going into a supermarket and the variety that is available to you, even in the post-COVID period. People come and are surprised. Foreigners come, tourists come and are surprised. Only last week I had that conversation with a manager in a global corporation from the United States, came from New York, was surprised, had been to other Caribbean countries, was surprised at what Barbados had to offer, and was surprised at how safe it was. That they could walk the streets, that they could do things. They didn't have to stay in an all-inclusive because Barbados had something to offer them. But if we are to maintain that, government cannot give it by itself. It has to be the contribution of all the citizens. So what do we want to give the country in terms of productivity, in terms of our attitude, in terms of giving our best, in terms of working a full day? And we have to ask the question, how did Japan, Singapore, and South Korea, countries which started off relatively poor at some point, and Singapore certainly started from basically the same position as we did, what were the factors and elements that they used? What were the mechanisms that they used to have the level of development that they now have? What is the difference in attitude and approach between their citizens and ours? Those are the kinds of things that we need to address. And if we want a high-level civil service and a meritocracy, then do we still want to come to our minister and say, you could get a job for me? Because we want the meritocracy. So it means you go and apply and you struggle, and if you are qualified, you get the job, and if you're not qualified, you do not get the job. And legitimately, I'm hearing sort of all say that there are people who want jobs, they want income, but they really do not want work. And people will tell you, I mean, as an MP, people came and said, I'm looking for a job. I tell you the truth, I want a hard work. Or, well, I want to work at X place, Y place, and Z place because Q place that you're offering me really too hard. I'm about that. And there's a voice note that went around late last year where somebody had been given a job and were complaining that the minister had offered them a job in home health. And their question was, really me to work in home health? That's all they think about me? You know, this is how we are. We do not want, and I'm talking about some of the contradictions. We talk all the time about ministerial intervention, but yet we want ministers to take responsibility for everything. We complain about a lack of efficiency and privatization, but yet we still complain about government and government performance and government inefficiencies. But if you say you want to privatize, that becomes a big no-no. The country has to confront the contradictions which are stopping us from moving forward, which are stopping an honest conversation, and which are stopping honest action. I think, Mr. President, you've signaled to me that I have about a minute left, and so I will move to my conclusion. There are a couple more points that I wanted to make, but I will conclude on this. As we move towards the estimates, as we stand in this new year, we've gone through COVID. We know we're facing the struggle of climate change. We understand, or we've heard about the implications of correspondent banking for trade and business. We know that we have challenges with trade. We understand that there are difficulties and attacks on the financial services sector. We know that our tourism product is still not where it used to be, even though we are optimistic about where it is going. At the same time, we recognize that it is perhaps a far more vulnerable sector as a foreign exchange earner than we may previously have imagined. As we deal with these difficulties, can we as a country ask ourselves, what am I prepared to give? Not just to make my life the best it can be, but to make Barbados the best it can be, and to treat fellow citizens as if they are, in fact, my brothers and sisters. And what is it that we want to get from the country, and what are we prepared to pay for? What is the role of government as a service provider or as a regulator? What level of taxes or what level of goods and services can a small island state with an aging population, a small number of people working, demanding increased goods and services, and simultaneously demanding reduced taxes, reduced costs, and reduced bills? What can the country reasonably afford to give us as a package of goods and services for every citizen? Education, healthcare, roadworks, etc., etc. What do we privatize and what do we keep under the umbrella of government? What is it going to cost and what are we prepared to pay for? And I think that this measure today opens up the country to this conversation. I'm glad for the reduction. Like other Barbadians, I will benefit from it. But can government keep carrying these reductions on everything indefinitely? And please bear in mind all of the things from giving people hampers to new benefits, NIS benefits for self-employed persons, to, I can't list them now because I know I'm out of time, sir, but all of the benefits that the government gave to the country when it had no money, when revenues were at a minimum. Let us ask ourselves really, as a country, what is it we want? what can we afford, and as individuals, what are we prepared to give back, and what are we prepared to pay to get what we want. I'm much obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Any other speakers? Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to express appreciation to all of the honorable members of the Senate who spoke in support of this resolution, starting first with Senator Emeritus Dr. Crystal Joyce. and the church has said amen, so it is so. I want to start there, Mr. President, because I remember being in this chamber not too long ago and hearing the honorable member speaking about us being able to afford the things that we want, and Barbados's debt sustainability and what our expenditure levels look like. So to be truthful, I was a little surprised to then hear what sounded almost like a bit of a contradictory presentation, which talked about the relationship between direct and indirect taxation, and then those very things on which we expend, which are above what we can afford, because the two things are very much connected. And I believe that our Deputy President, in an excellent presentation, shared what some of those things are, so I don't need to go into them. But I do want to take a moment to share the following. It is important that we consider and compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. And I remember many of us here are committed and dedicated regionalists. We believe in the region, we believe in CARICOM. We believe in our brothers and sisters from neighboring countries. And so, Mr. President, it was a source of great consternation for many of us that for many years, a protocol on contingent rights could not be agreed on at the level of CARICOM. And I'm sure that the Deputy President would remember the extended debate that the region had on contingent rights. And what do I mean when I describe contingent rights? Contingent rights spoke to an ancillary suite of benefits that went along with the freedom of movement of persons. So when a person moved throughout the CSME and they were moving to work in another country within the CSME, what were the contingent rights that went along with those persons? And we as a region could not agree, and one of the countries that had a great difficulty with that was Barbados. Now, why was that, Mr. President? That was because there was, and there still is, no other country anywhere in the Caribbean that provides an extensive social safety net at the same and equivalent level as Barbados. There is no other country in the region, and there was not then, and there still is not now, any other country that provides the same level of social services to its citizens as Barbados. It would have meant, Mr. President, that there were citizens moving from one jurisdiction into Barbados, and they were benefiting, therefore, from the extensive social safety net. Let me explain what some of those things were, Mr. President. And the Honourable Senator spoke, for example, about a couple of countries. In the case of Jamaica, just the other day, it said Jamaica, this is when the current Prime Minister was Minister of Education, and it made reference to him now. It said Trinidad is having one tertiary graduate per household. Jamaica is still struggling to produce one high school graduate per household. Now, why is that, Mr. President? I remember leaving Barbados at 18 years old and going to the University of the West Indies at Mona campus and seeing students that were waist high at the junctions of roads, not in school during the middle of the day. And I couldn't understand it because I had come from a Barbados where those children were in school. And I couldn't understand it even more so when people said to me, they can't afford for children to be in school. And I said, what do you mean? But isn't education free? Mr. President, Jamaica still has a scenario where 6 years of primary school education is compulsory and free. Secondary school is technically free, but parents have to pay for uniforms, teaching materials, registration fees, examination fees, school maintenance fees, and there are not the kinds of waivers in place that are in place here in Barbados. We have something that we take for granted called the textbook loan scheme that does not require Barbadian parents at the lowest level of income to have to purchase large numbers of books because the government makes sure that they are available. We mustn't take those things for granted. There is no other country in this region, Mr. President, that guarantees free tertiary level education at any point. They all stop at 16. Mr. President, we educate our children up to age 18 and in many instances up to master's levels at the University of the West Indies, therefore having the ultimate income mobility tool by way of access to free education, all the way up to tertiary level. In the case of Antigua, which was mentioned, which has a zero income tax rate, education is free up to 16 years old, but transport, school infrastructure, and class materials are accounted for under a levy of basic wages. So there's a mechanism there as well. And so, Mr. President, in the case of many of our comparators, in the case of Bahamas, for example, it is compulsory up to 16 years old. There is no compulsory or free tertiary level education above 16. Equally so, if you were to look at the healthcare system, Barbadians up to age 16 and 18 have the opportunity to have free, not just medical services, but dental services. That doesn't apply anywhere else. In the case of medical services, Mr. President, any one of us today and on any given day can walk into any medical facility, public medical facility, and access health care. A polyclinic, the hospitals, the district hospitals. We are now, Mr. President, going into estimates, as was said by Madam Deputy President. And I deliberately curtailed a lot of my comments on this particular resolution because I will have an opportunity to speak far more expansively within the context of the estimates debate when that comes up on not just my sector, but others as well. But Mr. President, we are also that country that has spent far more than any other country in the region on social services, on health care, and the provision of a universal access for all Barbadians up to now, Mr. President, for COVID-related expenses, and you will see those things reflected in the estimates of expenditure as approved from last financial year on what was actually initially planned, and we were able to annualize that over the pre-COVID years and during COVID. We mustn't take these things for granted. And so our taxes, I always used to say, and I want to pause just for a moment, and I want to be as open as I can be, and maybe say it from my heart as a person who, when we talk about things like when tourism stopped, and when planes stopped flying, and when the sector stopped working, Mr. President, I happened to be the minister responsible for that sector that we talk about anecdotally. There are things that I probably can't even begin to explain yet. And I remember at one point saying to my team, I think when this is all done, we're going to need some counseling. The things that we saw and went through. There are so many things that we still can't even speak about. When that sector that we call tourism stopped functioning, I sat in that chair. I know what it was like to deal with the fury of Barbadians who on the one hand wanted to work and to eat, but they wanted the country to close. I know what it was like, Mr. President, to have to deal with the fury of a public that on the one hand wanted tourists to be able to come so that their family members who worked in hotels and worked downstream of the tourism sector had a basic income, but simultaneously hated the idea of us paying compensation to those people who were stuck as a result of a crisis in the lab for 14 days. I know personally better than most what it was like to live through that. I know what it was like to have workers who could not get their severance payments and have to spend, in some instances, I want to recognize the National Insurance Scheme, because there were people who came in Saturday and Sunday to make sure that people were able to get their benefits. I know what it was like, Mr. President, to sit in that chair and to live the contradictions of this country every single day. I dealt with more personal attacks in the last 2.5 years than I probably dealt with in my entire lifetime. Because tourism stopped. And many people couldn't blame this esoteric thing that was out there called COVID. It was somebody's fault, and so it had to be mine. I know what that felt like, Mr. President. My family knows what it felt like. So it was not a light thing. And so when tourism started to recover and people started to come back, I also know, Mr. President, what it was like for people to be happy with the idea of working again and having an income again, but feeling as though these tourists are bringing back in COVID. And so there were times where we actually attacked the people who we were happy to welcome back. I know what it's like to get a call on a Saturday of visitors being accosted in the car park of a supermarket. When I'm bringing COVID, but hey, when I'm making people sick. So we wanted the income, we wanted the country to work again, but we didn't want the things that would make that happen. And that, Mr. President, is exactly what Madam Deputy President was speaking about in a much broader sense in everything that we do. There has to be a realization that government is making every possible effort to balance the needs and the wants of Barbadians and the standard of living to which we are accustomed and that we deserve, to keep the economy moving, but to also make sure that we can respond to the things that we say that we want, Mr. President. And these kinds of measures are really what I used to describe, and I still describe, whether it was to tourism sector players or it is now in my current incarnation in the business community, being responsible for the commercial space, to say to colleagues in the private sector as well, what you want on the one hand in a concession or in a reduction or in an exemption, in the one hand, as retailer A or tourism player A, you don't make a connection between the implications of the things that the state is foregoing on the one hand and what you are expecting and demanding on the other hand as citizen B. You still want your roads fixed. We still want to ensure that we can say proudly again that Barbados is that nation that provides tertiary level education. We still want to be able to say that our children, whether they are from a rich family or poor family, every Barbadian is able to have their ambitions for an education met. We still want to be able to say that our garbage is being collected on time. We still want to be able to have a world-class functioning Queen Elizabeth Hospital and all the investment that is required there for that to be so. Those things, Mr. President, because a government does not trade. A government does not do business. A government earns revenue from taxes. And taxes, Mr. President, must be compared apples with apples. And there is no other country in the world, with all its contradictions, with all of the things that we do that aren't perhaps as great as we would want them to be. I would not want to be a citizen of any other country in the world than this little Barbados. I am so proud of my country. The things that we are able to do, Mr. President, with limited resources and under pressure. When we, Mr. President, introduced the pandemic levy, which is one of the things that was raised by Senator Drake, the United Kingdom subsequently introduced what they call the windfall tax. When we talk about income taxes, below a certain rate level of income, Mr. President, we have a reverse tax credit. For others, we have a compensatory income credit. In other instances, we don't pay taxes at all. But we are here to support, in particular, those who are at the middle and the higher earning levels. Those are the categories that I know want to be able to say our taxes, we are able to see where they go. But, Mr. President, I want to make this point here. Many of us say, especially in the middle income groups, we say, well, I go to my private doctor when I go to the doctor. I don't need to use the polyclinics, so it doesn't benefit me. Many of us say, I don't care about electric buses because I drive my car. Many people say, I can send my child overseas to university if I want, so it doesn't affect me. But you know what, Mr. President? We live in a society. We just don't live in our homes. And there is a connection between what the government does in terms of an expansive, safe, social safety net and our ability to be safe in our homes, our ability to be able to walk the streets without fear, because when people don't have the basics that we take for granted at times, then we become targets. It is in everybody's interest, in every income group, to ensure that every Barbadian feels empowered, that every Barbadian feels as though they have a stake in the game, and that they have a place at the table. And so measures like the ones we are proposing today, we are hoping to be able to pass it today, where the value-added tax is reduced by 7.5, from 17.5 to 7.5% for the remainder of the year up until September, are important measures that make it universal across all income categories, where people are able to afford the basic provision of electricity. But we want to also help people to understand that many of the challenges that go into the costs associated with what we do are not domestic. They're not generated by the government of Barbados, but they are being mitigated where we can by the government of Barbados. Finally, Mr. President, on the question of the compact and the offsetting of the prices, I just want to be clear that on a monthly basis in the Sunday Sun, the ministry that I have responsibility for, the Director of Consumer Affairs and Commerce, they publish, and usually in a full-page ad, the prices of the compact on a monthly basis. We do take a report to the Cabinet of Barbados where we assess prices. I want to recognize that we have been able over the last month as well to bring the University of the West Indies students in on their Give Back program, and they have been actively working along with the Ministry of Commerce to be able to look at what is happening with prices. And we have also undertaken, Mr. President, to assess prices not just within the compact and with signatories to the compact, but outside of the compact. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that the Prime Minister on Monday was able to say that we are seeing the netting out of price savings to consumers by increases in other areas, and she specifically mentioned vegetables. What we have seen, Mr. President, is a 25, 26% on average increase in the cost of vegetables. But, Mr. President, we also heard from Madam Deputy President about scale. Small production results oftentimes in increased prices. If your production is smaller and your volumes are smaller, then it's going to result in prices. We also saw, Mr. President, increases in the prices of products related to cleaning, items like bleach and so on. But here's what I also want to flag, Mr. President. Yesterday, I had a really great meeting with the representatives from the Healthy Caribbean Coalition and the Association for Childhood Obesity. And they were speaking about the things that we choose to eat in the supermarket. What I can say, Mr. President, is that when we analyzed the data coming in from the assessors who went into the market, there was an increase in items that otherwise would be considered high salt, high fat, high sugar. And so, again, the appeal here is also for us to make healthier choices. It really has to be for Barbadians, when we go to the supermarket, to make choices that don't then contribute on the back end to an increase in non-communicable diseases and the impact on the healthcare system, and with it, healthcare expenditure, because that is also a connecting thread that we have to be conscious of, Mr. President. And so with these not so few words, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into committee for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and Honourable the Senate resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 do now stand part.
Question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour kindly say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to be the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the reading of this bill a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the passing of this bill and having it cited as the Value Added Tax Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Value Added Tax Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say nay. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now therefore passed and so cited.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Minor Offences Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, this is a minor bill, but not quite so minor. It has generated a considerable amount of debate in the public space, and perhaps it is there that I would wish to start with what this bill is not. Mr. President, this is not a bill to prohibit kite flying. Mr. President, this is not a bill to stop people from flying kites. Mr. President, the third thing this bill is not a bill to stop people from flying kites. It is not either a bill, Mr. President, to stop children from going into any public space and enjoying an age-old pastime, which is kite flying. Mr. President, it is also not a bill to stop people from flying kites with bulls. Everybody knows what a bull is. We grew up in this Barbados. It is not a bill, Mr. President, to stop people from flying kites with bulls. What it is, Mr. President, it is a measure to ensure that we do everything we do in consideration of others. And that, Mr. President, is not a legislative function, but we grew up with the golden rule which said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Mr. President, I could sleep through a storm. Nothing stops me from sleeping. I am an insomniac, yes, but that's probably because I drink too much coffee or tea. But usually at night, I can sleep. Mr. President, when my daughter was born almost 24 years ago, I remember my grandmother and others saying to me, don't create a quiet space when the child is going to sleep because you must train children to sleep through anything, especially when sometimes they're out on the road. But Mr. President, we don't live just for ourselves. We live among communities. And there are some of us that like to say things like Barbados is not just an economy, but it is a society. And if it is a society, then that means it is also a community. And that means that we must translate that beyond cliched terms into meaningful actions on each of our parts. What does it mean when we say we are a community and a society? It means we live in consideration of those who live around us. We also, Mr. President, are as fascinated by the idea of kite flying around Easter. I grew up with either buying a kite. My mother used to work at St. George Secondary, and there was a watchman there named Tyrone that I grew up, and every single year Tyrone made sure I had a kite. It was a pretty, pretty kite. I would fly that kite on the pasture of St. George Secondary when my mother was at work if I was out from school. That is what I grew up doing, Mr. President. I remember having an uncle who used to compete every year in a competition at the garrison to see who flew the biggest kite. And it was a spectacle to be able to see. I grew up with that, Mr. President, like all of us. This is not to stop any of that. I grew up seeing people along the road with the kite set up and all the pretty colors and people stopping and choosing which one they want for their children. And the children saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, daddy, 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 I want that one." I grew up with a bat kite as well. We know what's a bat kite. You buy it in the supermarket, it's plastic, and you put in the sticks, and you go and you have the cord already attached to it. I know what that is, Mr. President. This is not a bill to stop any of that, and it is unfortunate that there are some who have perpetuated a false narrative about what this bill is not. What this bill is, Mr. President, is a measure to ensure that those who live in our society, in our community, who can't sleep through anything, who are dealing with illnesses, the elderly, those people who struggle with all kinds of challenges and need to be able to have a night's rest, not to have to deal after the hours of 7 p.m. in the night with the sound of a bull overhead their houses. We've also known, Mr. President, growing up in this Barbados, what it is like to hear the sound of a bull buzzing all through the night. And because I can sleep through it, Mr. President, doesn't mean that I can impose that on someone else. It doesn't mean that everyone else has to live by the things that I am comfortable doing, Mr. President. It means that in a different household, somebody else may have a different consideration. Mr. President, can I tell you? I hate smoke. We've had multiple conversations around people cleaning up around their houses and burning smoke because they want their house to be looking clean. They want to rake up the dry leaves and they put them to burn. But Mr. President, we don't know who lives next door to us who's asthmatic. We don't know who lives downwind of us who has a respiratory challenge. I know, Mr. President, what it was like to be unbothered by that for the most part, even though I hate smoke. Especially when you just wash your fresh curtains and you put out your curtains and it stinks of smoke and you can't get it out, you got to start all over again. That's an inconvenience, yes. But I also know what it is for my mother to have surgery on her lungs and come home with a respiratory challenge and have to deal with somebody else's smoke from nearby. So what we're talking about here, Mr. President, is not about kites. It is about community. It is about consideration. It is about regard and respect for others. And so it is ensuring, Mr. President, that under this amendment, that persons who, for whatever reason, cannot be persuaded by moral suasion to take a kite with a bull down from over someone else's house because it doesn't bother you or because you enjoy it, you are insisting that that must be imposed on someone else and using a false narrative that it is constituting a Barbadian pastime. Mr. President, that level of inconsideration has to be legislated is perhaps an unfortunate reality. But we are simply using the legislation to say to people, please think of others. Consider others whose circumstances you do not know. And so what is the legislation actually saying, Mr. President? It is one, between the hours of 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., it is asking you to take your kites down as long as they have bulls on them. If your kite does not have a bull on it, you can leave it up all night if you like because it doesn't bother anybody. But if it has a bull on it, Mr. President, it has to be taken down between the hours that I have just mentioned because we must not live in selfishness. We must not. We must not think that everything is about what we want and what is convenient for us or what we like, because it affects other people in the society that we talk about. Mr. President, it says where you have contravened this requirement that the Barbados Police Service gets involved. They don't come immediately and give you a fine. They ask you to take it down. If you are the owner or the person in control of the kite, they ask you to take it down. And failure to do so results in a penalty. That penalty, Mr. President, is outlined in the draft of the legislation, and it is a fine at paragraph 4A, subsection 4. It is a summary conviction of a fine or imprisonment for 6 months. But the imprisonment for up to 6 months only comes in, Mr. President, if you fail to pay the fine. Now, I don't think that this administration wishes to criminalize anybody for offenses such as these because they are, by definition, minor. By definition, they're minor. But here's what this legislation is attempting to do, because what we know, we talk about it in terms of project management, what is not monitored is not done. What is not enforced is not done either. And so in order for us to ensure that people understand the seriousness of selfishness in a society and the absence of consideration for others, these are measures that are put in here to ensure that people comply. It is meant to incentivize people to ensure that they comply with the amendment to the legislation and that they take their kite down. If, Mr. President, the government were to come with a piece of legislation that says, take down your kite when night come, that's what we want you to do, and did not have penalties for failure to do so, then there'd be no incentive. People would do as they would continue to do what they're doing now because there are no consequences. And Mr. President, many of us in here are parents, we have nieces, we have nephews, we have children who are in our care. And we know that without the fear of consequences, sometimes it is difficult to get a child or those in our care to do what is being required of them. This legislation, Mr. President, is not seeking to criminalize people, but it is seeking to get people to comply with an instruction that really ought not to be an instruction. It should be about us living in consideration for our community. But since in many instances, Mr. President, as you would see throughout other sections of this original legislation, minor offenses, they have to be legislated because sometimes what we think is normal or what we think should be natural isn't always so. And so legislation comes in to account for those circumstances. Mr. President, you also have in this instance the circumstances where either in Section 4A or Section 4B, what happens when a person fails to comply with a direction given by the Barbados Police Service. And that is outlined there, Mr. President, and that becomes a fixed penalty that may be recovered as a debt to the state in Section 4C in civil proceedings and not criminal proceedings. It is important for us to be able to make that clear. Section 4C is very, very clear when it says in civil proceedings before a magistrate and not criminal. So that is one of the other things that this bill is not. It is not an attempt to criminalize people. It actually is a civil penalty as well. So, Mr. President, I know that there will be other things that I will have to say, but I'm going to keep those things for the closing because I expect that they will come up during the course of the discussion. But I want, in closing, to repeat where I started. This bill is not a measure to stop people from flying kites. This bill is not a measure to stop people from flying kites with bulls. This bill is not a measure to stop people from engaging in the age-old Barbadian pastime of kite flying. This bill is not a measure to put people out of business or out of work who manufacture and produce kites. It is not an attack on our children. It is instead a measure to ensure that persons can sleep during the nighttime hours without having the disruption between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. of a kite with a bow. And that, Mr. President, is what the bill is about. And with these few words, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Speakers? Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good day, everyone. I wish to say a few words on this bill before us, this amendment before us, as I think it is timely. It seeks to prevent the flying of kites during a particular period of time in the night, I believe from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, time of the day, 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. And these would be kites that we know here in Barbados to have. You use the modern term bulls. We used to say voos when I was growing up. They had voos on them, you know, you put a voo on your kite. Yeah. Yes, I'm from St. John, sir. We used to put voos on our kites. But the bill is more far-reaching than it appears to be at the surface, because it seeks to deal with a number of things that I believe speak more to our society than simply to flying kites with noise. There are social aspects to this amendment that confront us. Why do we have to legislate this? Why do we have to formulate legislation to tell people not to fly kites at night because they're annoyance to people? Or why do we have to stand here reflecting on this? Because we have a society where people do not recognize that they are each other's keeper, and what they're doing may have an effect on others, a negative effect on others. But it also gives us the opportunity to speak to something that we do not often speak to in this region, and I do not believe many people in the world. Sort of noise pollution. Noise pollution. So I'll just deal with those three areas briefly. Why do we have to legislate the prevention of tying out a kite at night? You know, we grew up in a Barbados, most of us, well, I believe all of us, where I believe that such a problem would have been a simple discussion in the village. A simple talk to someone, and everything would have been settled. But now we seem to have a society that lacks that kind of discipline, lacks that kind of respect for the other, and what our actions are doing to the other. One may recall one of our calypsos this year. Poor Rudifus had to leave his neighborhood because people were riding through with motorbikes and keeping noise outside. And then when he moved to what he thought was a quieter place, apparently there was a church bell affecting him. I can assure you, sir, it's not St. George's church bell. People actually appreciate the bell at St. George because it helps them to keep time. I don't know what type of bell Rudifus was hearing, but that caused a problem for him as well, sir. And so it really comes down to this lack of respect for the other, and this lack of discipline that has entered in our society, where it seems as though even the elders who in the village setting or even in the household would have been able to say, you know, don't do that. Cannot even say that anymore. It doesn't have any impact. It speaks to a society where people, and though it's a minority, it's significant enough a minority for us to have to come in here to do this. Because one person could be affecting a neighborhood of thousands of people and do not seem to care about what his or her actions may be doing to those people. And it really begs the question, do we really care about the other person? And it goes back to something that was said in a speech not long ago about rights. I have a right to do this. I have a right to fly my kite as I wish. If you can't deal with it, that's your problem. Or as my daughter told me the other day, I was telling her something, about some challenge I was experiencing, and she said, you know, Daddy, that sounds like a you problem. So that is the new thing now. That's a you problem. And so nobody seems to care what their actions may be doing to the other person. And it really goes back to what Senator Thompson was speaking of earlier. There needs to be a return to a level of civics in this country. We need to teach it. We need to inculcate civics in our schools, in our teaching, because clearly our young people, and some of these are not young, too many of our people do not seem to understand what being a citizen in a space like this means, and how our actions can have effects on other people. And so I believe that this bill gives us an opportunity to revisit this and look at the need for this kind of teaching in our public spaces. But I also believe that it gives us the opportunity to speak to the broader issue of noise pollution, as I mentioned earlier, sir. I don't know if many of you had the experience I had during the COVID-19 lockdown, but it was blissful. You didn't realize how noisy this country really is. I mean, you experience it from time to time when there's a power blackout. But during the COVID period, you actually could hear yourself. And it was pleasant. I said that to say that Barbados is a very noisy place. Many of us may not recognize it because we've become accustomed to what is around us. And so this bill, though it is about kite flying during a particular period, it is also about the motorbikes that speed through quiet hamlets in this country with one wheel in the air. It is about when the village shop believes that it needs to have karaoke night into the wee hours of the morning, with no care for how close the houses are around them, and the DJ is speaking at the top of his voice, and this is at 2 and 3 in the morning, and you wonder if there's a cutoff point for these things. And the people who are singing the karaoke may think that they're soothing us because they're singing a couple oldie goldies and things. But the reality is that they are a far cry from soothing, and cry in capital letters. You know, and that's what we face in this country on a daily basis. And the damage may be more far-reaching than we may be able to assess at this point in time, because this is not just about kites flying at night. The World Health Organization in 2018 published an updated environmental noise guidelines for the European region. And that study provides noise values for different levels in the region. And it says, it is based on an assessment of evidence resulting from systematic literature and reviews for association between environmental noise exposure and cardiovascular disease, metabolic effects, irritability, effects on sleep, cognition, quality of life, mental health and well-being. All these things were found to be affected by the noise levels in the community. As I said, we may not be at a stage at this time to assess that, because I don't even think we've given any thought to testing the decibel levels of our noise. It also said that 1 in every 5 persons in Europe is exposed to levels of environmental noise that are considered harmful to health. That's 20%. This has a particular effect on a demographic that is high in this country, and I dare say is dear to us. That's our elderly. An article published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Association 2020 has indicated that a growing number of studies now point to noise as an influence on the risk of dementia. Noise is an influence on the risk of dementia. And it also cited a study which says that 10 decibels more of daytime neighborhood noise is associated with 36% higher odds of mild cognitive impairment. It also went on to say that 10 decibels increase in daytime noise is associated with 30% higher odds of Alzheimer's. So when we look around our country and we realize that a lot of people may be experiencing dementia, let us look at noise and the noise levels in our country as a possible contributor to what is taking place. As I said, this is telling information for us in Barbados, where over 31% of our population is over 55. Over 31% of the Barbadian population is over 55. Senator Cummings just said that she could sleep through a storm, sir. And that's because I believe she hasn't reached that level, that age limit as yet. But I also heard an aside which says, every little noise affects me. And there's a reason for that too, sir. There's a scientific reason. Seniors are more sensitive to sounds. I'm not saying that the person who said that every little noise affects them is a senior, but seniors are more sensitive to sounds. But being sensitive to sound doesn't mean you hear better. What it means is that you're not able to filter sounds. And so you hear everything, and it becomes confusing. In 2019, there was a study that suggested that younger individuals can filter out sounds, while 60-year-old individuals remain sensitive to all sounds in their environment. And they hear all sounds loud and soft. And what that means, that they cannot filter out the sounds that they do not want to hear. And as a result, listening to all these sounds leads to listening fatigue, difficulty hearing, since the auditory cortex of the brain becomes bombarded. This is exacerbated at night, sir. And I will tell you why it's exacerbated at night. There's something called REM. Let me just get the full word. Rapid eye movement sleep, which occurs just about 90 minutes into your sleep. And it says that there are 4 stages of this rapid eye movement sleep. And what this does for you is that it puts you in a paralyzed state, And this is when your dreams and so on play out. So while you're dreaming and so, you cannot move too much and act out what is happening in your dreams. It is also responsible for memory and moods and all those kinds of things. It's a sort of deep sleep. What they've found is that all individuals, adults, experience 25% of REM per night, while babies require 50. 50% of their sleep is REM. But what we also know is that the brain is always listening out for sounds. It becomes very active at night so that one can be alerted. And the more sounds there are, the more noise there is, the less the ability to have this REM that your body needs. And so, sir, this bill is not only about flying kites and annoying me with noise. It is about the damage we may be doing toward the elderly in this country, in this society. People who do not deserve this. They do not deserve this. My goodness, you could fly the kite during the day down by the beach somewhere. What do you have to tie it out at night for? And think about the number of people that we can be affecting. We have been worried about Alzheimer's and dementia in our community for a long time. And the question is, has this noise been contributing to what these people are experiencing? And so as we consider this amendment, sir, I wish for us to look a little deeper at the level of society. And I wish to appeal to those persons out there who feel the need to tie up their kite. I don't know how many people we have who are willing to go down on the beach and cut it, but that's a different matter, sir. But I wish to appeal to those people out there who feel this great need to tie these kites out with these loud noises at night, very loud, to consider the damage they could be doing to their very grandmother who is in the house with them, or the old lady next door, or the old man that they care about down the street. Because part of the problem we have in this society, sir, is the definition of the word respect. Because some of these people think that they have respect for you if they pass and say, yeah, pastor, yeah, grands. But it has to go deeper than that. It has to go to me feeling and caring about what is affecting you, what I am doing that may be affecting you. And for years we've been complaining about this matter. But I hope that we will delve a little deeper into the science of what noise may be doing to our people and what this type of noise at night, the type of effect it can have on that demographic of our society who have worked really hard to get us where we are and now cannot enjoy the peaceful latter years that God has given them. I appeal to those out there who are flying these kites. We've given you the daytime, even though we may have to study that too. Even though we may have to look at that as well. Because as I said just now, 10% increase in daytime noise can have a 30% effect on the odds of one experiencing dementia and Alzheimer's. So if that is the case, we may have to look at the daytime too, but for now, please do not tie out the kites at night. Remember the people who need to have rest. Remember the old people who may be affected by every sound that is around them and cannot process, do not have the ability to filter it out, to sleep through the storm as younger persons like Senator Cummins can. Consider them when you're tying your kite out. And with those few words, I wish to support this amendment.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers. Senator Maladu.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Perhaps my hearing wasn't so well. Thank you. As I stand, I have a number of notes here to speak to you, but the truth is that Senator Cummins, I'll endorse everything that you have said in the introduction of this bill. Senator Rogers, Reverend Rogers, I'd like to endorse everything that he's also said. But I would like to just perhaps start where he almost left off, which is to say that I would even be in support of this bill going further. And let me say why. We have restricted kites with bulls, and as Senator Cummins has at pains to tell us, we're not talking about restricting kite flying. We all like it. We all grew up in it. I too grew up in it. And I do remember my back kite as well. It was never as good as the kite with the tails and my snaking loops and stuff that I could do from time to time. But the challenge I have with this, and just to expand on this point, is the simple physics of these kites with bulls is this. The kite flies downwind of the person flying it. Often you're using 200, 300, 400, even sometimes as much as I'm told as 900 meters of string downwind. The kite looks beautiful, it's snaking in the sky, but the person flying the kite cannot hear the bull. And if they can hear it, they're hearing about 10% of it. And that troubles me. It troubles me not just between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., because people have a right to peaceful enjoyment, whether they be at school trying to study, sitting at their home and relaxing, not sleeping, but relaxing, reading a book, and they have to have this kite over their head all the time with a bull. Or they're in their hospital bed trying to recover, sir. So it's not just annoying for some people from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. It is annoying all the time. And the person flying the kite and the enjoyment of the kite, well, I remember flying the kite, was the tug on the string and seeing it and getting it a snake and doing all these things. But you can't hear it. It's downwind of you, 500 meters, 900 meters over somebody else's head. So I think we could have gone further. But for now, let us see how this works. Two other quick points. While I do appreciate, Mr. President, that it has been said that this is a minor offense, I want it to be clear that the consequence of the minor offense can be significant, though. It is a minor offense, but the consequence can be significant. As Senator Rogers has pointed out, I did not know these things. The long-term effect that this noise could have. And where I guess I will end is that overall, as we are all saying here, you know, your right to do something at some point in time can't impose upon my rights. And I think there was a U.S. Supreme Court justice, he's often quoted, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I'll just pick up my notes so I don't get it wrong. He's reported that how he described this, Mr. President, was this way. He said, your right to swing your arms ends just where the other man's nose begins. And your right to fly a kite with a bull, sir, ends over my roof. If you're going to make noise over my roof, your right to fly a kite with a bull ends there. So I will endorse everything that Senator Rogers has said. I endorse and I support this bill. And I am also willing to go further should the necessity be there. With those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalouk. Senator, Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Mr. President, I have promised the Honourable Leader of Government Business that I will make my shortest speech ever. So it is easy to do because really the Honourable Senator Dr. Rogers made my speech, but there are just a few more observations which I would wish to add. I want to thank him for all of the elements that he raised, and I wanted to make the point that I think government needs to consider the enactment of noise and environmental pollution legislation in its entirety, because noise pollution is but one component of environmental pollution, and there are many elements to it. And I want to touch briefly on some of those. Time me, sir, time me. Shortest speech ever. It does relate to safety, health and wellness, general well-being, various demographics, and the social and other needs for time and space and rest, given or multiple interests on what we do at various ages. And Senator Malalouk made the point about studying and watching television and other activities which are also interrupted. Now, I don't think that we should attempt to kill the culture, though Senator Malalouk's points are well made about people not, the flyer not hearing the bull. I myself enjoyed kite flying immensely when I was younger, so I haven't flown a kite in years, but perhaps I should do so again. Anyway, to get back to the points that I wanted to make, often it is not just a single kite, but multiple kites that are out in the same location because it's a group of friends who will all put out their kites. And they stake them out, often long distances from where they live. And this is one of the important points that I want to make in respect of this legislation, that it is going to require the cooperation of the public to identify the kite owners, because it really, if a kite is staked out far from where you live, the chance of the police or those looking to find the owner are going to be relatively slim. And in Barbados, we complain about crime, we say the police must do something, and government needs to do something about it. But we ourselves never come forward and give information, say what we know, say what we have seen, say what we've heard, or point the finger, metaphorically, at the person whom we know to be liable or responsible. So if we want to address this problem, government has done its part by bringing legislation onto the statute books, or is in the process. It will be completed, the process, the formalities will be completed shortly. But we do need the cooperation of the public if the legislation is going to work, if it's going to have some bite. In relation to noise pollution, there are other components of noise pollution that Senator Rogers did not address, which I would wish to draw concern. In communities, it is lawnmowers starting up as soon as the sun breaks, that people come out with lawnmowers. And for people who work long hours, people who are studying at night, I often go to bed at 2, 3 o'clock. So if somebody starts a noise at 6, it really wakes me up. If they started at 5, it ruins, well, what is my night's sleep. And for a lot of people who are working shifts, students who are studying, people who are looking after the elderly, and are themselves getting very little sleep, or for the elderly who have difficulty sleeping. And Senator Rogers was some people in my age group and over my demographic, how we can filter noise and so yes, yeah. So we have issues, sir, and it becomes a problem. So that is, that noise made from legitimate domestic sources, because cutting your lawn is a necessity and it's a legitimate domestic source of noise. Another area of noise that causes a tremendous problem within communities is the noise of heavy-duty equipment. People who are using, whether they're digging up areas to start construction, whether it is people with mechanic shops and body workshops who have drills and I don't know what planers, I don't know what you would call them, sorry? Grinders, that make a tremendous amount of noise, and that high-pitched buzzing sound that I am very bad with noises, sir. I can't even bear to hear a kettle boiling. And there are people who are very, very sensitive to repetitive noises, to high-pitched noises, and so on. So that is something that needs to be looked at. Then there is the question, if you're talking about environmental, comprehensive environmental legislation, it's as Senator Cummings said, those people who are burning garbage, burning stuff, as they say, burning debris and cuttings from their lawn, burning all newspapers, just burning because they seem to have nothing else to do, because there are people who burn things all the time. Every day they got a little something and they put it up, and then they're standing there with the hose, or they put it in a can and they go inside and they leave it burning. So all of this is part of the culture, but part of what creates a high level of nuisance and health risks for others. In relation to smoke pollution, you have vehicles, particularly public service vehicles that you see, and have construction equipment vehicles belching black smoke in a society where people have rhinotracheal problems, bronchial problems, where asthma and related illnesses are a major problem. So that too needs to be addressed and properly covered, and not just covered and but properly policed. The final area to which I think some attention needs to be paid if you're doing legislation is the operation of business places and the degree of technology that they should be mandated to use to buffer the noise that the operations of their businesses generate. There are factories and other businesses that generate high levels of noise when all the machinery and equipment is working and it's belching off smoke and so on, and there seems to be no legislation in place that covers, regulates, monitors dampens, reduces, restricts, etc. that. It is a major problem for people because the hours are not regulated. I live very near to the government's landfill. They have started operations now very early in the mornings. They're going very late in the evenings, and they're operating 7 days a week, where they used to operate 5. At the landfill. And this is something that I think needs to happen in our society. When we have, there are people who have lived near, for instance, to quarries and quarrying operations, who for years have complained about the nuisance impact and the health implications of those, and nothing happens. And I think that we are at the stage now, our society is becoming highly industrialized, very sophisticated, that persons and entities which own and operate noise, smoke, or pollution generating facilities should be mandated to have a conversation with the people in the communities who are going to be impacted by the way in which they operate, and some restriction on those operations. So when you live downwind of a landfill, downwind of a body mechanic, downwind of a quarry, that you can know how they're going to be operating, if they're going to expand their hours, if they're proposing to move to a 7-day-a-week cycle as opposed to a 5, and that there can be a conversation that allows you not to shut down the people's operation because you understand the need for it, but allows you to live in some degree of comfort. And the managers of the organizations ought to be compelled to have a conversation with you rather than not speak when you try to speak with them and ask them what is going on. Just saying, sir. And my final point on this, sir, is that as a society, and we spoke to it in the earlier presentation, senators who spoke to it here, it has to do with, and I don't mean, Senator Dr. Rogers used the expression, I used it earlier, this whole business of being our brother's keeper. There used to be a time when we were a kinder, more caring society. It is not a you problem, it's a we problem. And if there is a problem, even if it is a you problem, let me talk about it a little bit and come to some kind of conclusion that both you and me or we could exist comfortably. What we are talking about, sir, whether it is the karaoke or the motorcycles doing wheelies at 3 o'clock in the morning as they race up and down the highway, and that impacts me as well, or factories, whatever we are talking about, really comes down to reasonableness. What is reasonable behavior, conduct, and practice for individuals, for commercial entities, such as would allow other individuals to have a level of reasonable comfort, safety, and well-being in their homes, in their places of recreation, in their societies. And at the end of the day, it has to be a conversation that government, state entities, the church, the school, and other organizations which make up our society address, because frankly, Mr. President, one cannot legislate reasonableness. And that really is what we are talking about, the reasonableness of the conduct of some of our brothers and sisters and the implications of their unreasonableness for the wider society. And that, Mr. President, is my shortest speech ever.
Thank you very much, Senator Thompson. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be extremely short. But listening to everyone speak, I totally agree with all of the things that I've been hearing. But it also speaks to a trend, and I think Senator Thompson touched on it briefly. The Barbados of, let's say, 20, 30 years ago did not have these problems to this wide extent. Which means, if I'm going on what Senator Rogers' data suggests about dementia and the effects that sound may have on persons in speeding up that process, and with what seems to me an increasing amount of people that I have known to be coming down with this same condition, it means then, one, in my estimation, that yes, we are living in a much noisier society, but it also speaks to what I call a lack of, one, consequential thinking within the society, and two, a lack of ethics within the society. Which, when we dig deeper, these are the foundations that built communities, which were taught first by that old saying, charity begins at home. And so it troubles me, Mr. President, that we have to continuously find ourselves in these chambers to bring legislation to deal with matters that should really be dealt with on a family basis, on a neighbor-to-neighbor basis, on being able to understand, as Senator Rogers made the point, and I think it needs to be continue to be made all the time. You're going to be affecting predominantly the older persons within our society, upon whose shoulders, backs, everything, and all of us enjoy what we enjoy today. If, as a human being, one cannot work out your obligation to your neighbors, especially to the elderly within our society, there has to be a serious problem in how you think. We got to get to the root problem is, why is it that people are not thinking about their actions and what consequence it has on others? And even though we talk about getting civics, I support that 1,000%. And having civics taught again. But if a person cannot think, stop and think about it. If a person cannot think, you can preach ethics, civics, until God comes for the world. It will make no difference to them. And if by chance the person is what we call in social antisocial, who gets their enjoyment from creating most havoc, you've got another problem on your hand. And one of the problems that we have had for a very long time is that we cannot identify these people because we don't know what to look for. And so you find them all through. You find them in every major place where they can create havoc. They find themselves in it, even if it means going to university and get 25,000 degrees, so that 25,000 million people they can offset, they will do it. Because that is the kind of brain that you're dealing with. And legislation, although it is necessary, at this point in time, it should be of concern for all of us that we have to come to this point where we have to create legislation to ask people to be sensible. Think about it. As we would say, the society is becoming very low-toned. And it is concerning. Because all the good things that government is trying to do, all the good things that individuals are trying to do will come to naught if this particular demographic is allowed, as young people say, to run the road. We have to begin, and they say this without any apologies. And as my father would say, who vex, vex. Who please, please. We have to get, and I heard the Honorable Prime Minister talk about it, we need to get those parenting programs into the societies ASAP. Because the root cause of all of these things, people with the motorcycle carrying on the highways, you look on videos and you see people sending about a video, and I'm scared, no. Sending around a video with young men somewhere in the United States of America riding bicycles and riding them at cars and then swerving off. And under the caption had, coming soon to Barbados. You can imagine. Right? But this is where our society is heading. And oftentimes, because it doesn't necessarily impact on you right away, a lot of people turn a blind eye to it. But I spent too many years working in government industrial school and watching what happens to a society when you do not pay attention to those persons, families, communities, whatever word you want to use, that have these sort of problems. Time, in my mind, Mr. President, is running out. Time is running out. And I would like to appeal to parents who can hear me. Like I said before, if you vex, you vex. If you get it, bless your heart. But you need to do what you are supposed to do. That is to train your children. Stop leaving it for school teachers, for church, athletes, and all these other people to be role models for your children. Charity begins at home. And if you do not take it seriously, the obligation upon you as a parent to deal with your children, my advice to you is do not get any. Because what you're doing is you are putting an entire country in constant state of fear from one thing to the next. If it's a kite ball, then it is guns, then it is something else. It's one packing up, one after the other. You can't, and a society cannot grow in an environment like that. As much as we like to talk and quarrel about government and doing this and government and doing the next and all the high prices and this thing, we might not be able to go outside to go to work to get the economy to grow if you allow these things to get away. And so with those serious words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. President. This has been wonderful. So much of what I wanted to say, I no longer have to, because there's been a lot of discussion about noise pollution, about things such as being neighborly, just being considerate of other people, that I don't think I necessarily need to repeat. I'd like to share a little bit of a story. There was a point in my life when I used to live in Hinesbury Road, and I never thought it was noisy. Then after that, I moved to a city. I never thought it was noisy either. And then I moved to St. George. And for the first few weeks, I could not sleep because it was so quiet. And I just couldn't get myself to settle in this quiet. I don't live in St. George anymore. But the point is that for some people, this noise is something that they may not even recognize that they experience it, that it is affecting them, or anything of the sort. And one of the things that certainly was a feature was the kites. It didn't really used to bother me as such, but at a certain time of year, you know, the kites were buzzing at night, in the day. But for me, at that time, that was just normal. And clearly, I was under 50, as I still am. So perhaps there are some reasons why it did not affect me in some ways. But I just bring that because sometimes it might be helpful, and as much as it is important to say we need to be considerate of others, and we do, to think of the other side as well. One of the other things that I would like to just mention is something I hear people complaining about quite often. It was mentioned in here as well, is the matter of things such as weed whackers. People complain, the weed whacker early on a Sunday morning. And I understand, I want to sleep in too. But I also somewhat understand the reason why somebody is going to get up early on a Sunday morning and use their weed whacker. Because if they have to work the whole week, and Sunday is the day that they have off, and they want to get out before the sun is very hot. And if they have to do it themselves and they don't have someone who can do it for them at a time during the week, I can sort of understand the other side of this, why persons do this. So it may not be that some individuals are purposefully being inconsiderate, but they are doing things at the times that they can do them so that they are not causing other nuisances, mosquitoes and things, because they have a big set of tall grass, and you still gonna be complaining why this person don't cut the grass. So I think sometimes, and this is why I'm glad as well that this legislation does not automatically seek to criminalize persons, that the first step is actually to get them to bring down their kites. I have some concerns about enforcing this because somebody will have to prove that that's my kite. If it was me, you gotta prove that this is my kite. I went out there, and yes, I was dealing with the kite, but that's because I too am concerned that this kite is noisy in the area, and I don't know who the kite concerns. But my point is, enforcement may be somewhat problematic, and I am not 100% sold on this legislation being the solution to this, except that persons may not be aware, and this awareness may cause them to say, let me take down my kite, or if I want to keep the kite up, I'm going to remove the boat. So the enforcement, I think, is an issue. I don't know if this is necessarily the best use of police time, so I do hope that people will be more aware of their actions and the effects of their actions, because we are having this debate and discussion about these noisy kites. We've mentioned already that there is a broader problem of noise pollution, and we've heard the health implications of this. The World Health Organization has spoken about it and has provided documents and documentation on the effects. And it is here that I would like to perhaps offer a suggestion, or let me call it an observation at this point, Mr. President. We have legislation called the Health Services Act, Cap 44, and there are regulations that accompany this legislation. Health Services Nuisance Regulations, nuisances regulations. And there are a lot of things in there that are covered as nuisances, including some of the things that I just spoke about, mosquitoes, having bottles and debris around your premises. A whole set of things are covered as nuisances. And one of my concerns is that although this issue is a serious one, it is too targeted because it focuses specifically on one cause of noise pollution, and that is the kite. And I think that perhaps these regulations could be used to address this issue of noise pollution more broadly, because we already have legislation that exists in the area of health to address nuisances. Some of the things we have spoken about in here already, that other members of this honorable house have spoken about, are covered in that legislation or in those regulations already. The issue is clearly one of enforcement. And this is something that we do need to take seriously. So I have a little bit of a question about the placement of this in the Minor Offences Act because of that. Because I think we could have a broader approach that actually speaks to some of the elements of noise pollution and the health effects somewhere else. I also note that Barbados has a national noise policy. It has had one since 2007. I don't know what is in it, but from the WHO, exactly. And I think that we should emphasize this national noise policy, have a broader approach once again to addressing noise. And this may be useful because there may be particular people that feel targeted by this. I'm a kite flying man and I am targeted by this. But what is happening to others in our society who've been mentioned already, those that have karaoke bars and so on. And in economics, Senator Drates might know this, there's a concept, negative externality. So I am pursuing my livelihood by holding a karaoke on a particular night. It is an event that is popular. I bring in some income, and this helps to support me, my family, other people in the community get some enjoyment. But there is a negative repercussion of this on other members of the community. We can say the same thing of kite flying and some of the other activities we've discussed already. Even people with their home stereo systems and, you know, I have a pretty impressive one at home too that is very noisy. And these things can affect other people. So we need to also think about not being so targeted that certain persons are portrayed as the nuisances in society when there are many groups of people who are nuisances by the noise that they create and because of some of the activities they're involved in, not necessarily because they're intentionally seeking to become nuisances, but because of the other side of their activities. So that is one of the things that concerned me a little bit, how targeted this is, because there are so many other areas. I hear a lot of complaints, karaoke bars, the motorcycles at night, all of the things that we have mentioned already. So I hope that we will take a broader approach that treats to these, because you may feel as if part of your problem has been solved. The kites are no longer noisy in your area, but the karaoke still is happening up to whatever o'clock. All right. As others have said, we certainly cannot legislate neighborliness, manners, being considerate, having empathy, not being in multiple meetings simultaneously. These are not things that we can legislate, Mr. President. But hopefully these types of discussions will encourage us to, and I'm not even going to say to no longer be inconsiderate, but maybe to think differently about our actions. Think differently about our actions. Because you truly may not think you are inconsiderate, but your actions are having other consequences on persons that you have not borne in mind. And perhaps it is because, as I said, using my example when I was younger, none of these things really bothered me. I never thought anything was noisy. So somebody coming to tell me about noise, I would have been a little confused about what really the issue is. And then you end up saying, well, there's a miserable old woman in the gap or something. And it truly is a lack of understanding of the other perspective. Well, I don't even know if it's a you problem. At that time, I would have said it's not even a problem. You know, when you hear children talking about that's a miserable old man at the gap, that old man real miserable. And at that point in time, that is how you see them, as miserable, because you really cannot appreciate the effects of your actions on others. So I hope, beyond my suggestion about perhaps where some of this can be covered, even if it may take some time to have standalone legislation on noise pollution, I think we already have some regulations that can address this area. In addition to that suggestion or observation, I hope that this debate, if it is heard, does encourage people to think about their actions, because we cannot legislate everything. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension. I beg to move the suspension of the sitting of the Senate for lunch and to resume at 5 minutes after 3 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3:05 p.m. today. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 3:05 p.m. today.